Well, I hope that you have had a good day today. I hope your week has gone well. I hope you'll continue, hopefully, to have a good week. I hope you're excited to be able to study the Word of God tonight for the next few minutes. You know, what a privilege that is, that we have the opportunity to gather and to discuss the not only the words, but also the thoughts that God would want us to have. And I pray that every day of our life that we will at least spend some time thinking about things that are spiritual, getting our minds off of earthly things, ultimately so that we can make ourselves more like Jesus and lead others to Jesus. Before we get started, as always, if you are sick or you are hurting in any way, we want you to know that we are thinking of you and we love you and we are praying for you. If we don't know that you're sick, please let us know. We want to be praying for you. There are, I know, several people, and some of us are aware of several in the congregation that are sick, and I won't say the names of those individuals for the sake of privacy, but we know who they are at Eastwood, and let's certainly remember them in our prayers. They need them. We're in Ecclesiastes chapter 10. If we don't finish Ecclesiastes chapter 10 tonight, Lord willing, we'll finish Ecclesiastes chapter 10 next week when we get into chapter 11. But Ecclesiastes chapter 10 starts off with Proverbs again, right? This is something that we have noticed that in the book of Ecclesiastes, namely that the book isn't devoid of using Proverbs. Notice what is said in verse 1. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Well, we certainly are able to see, hopefully, the picture that Kohelet is trying to paint here, right? We should recognize at least that perfume would often give off a sweet, maybe, certainly a pleasant smell. But notice what would happen if a dead fly was in that perfume. Instead of producing a sweet and pleasant smell, there would be one of a horrible stench. In other words, let's look at something so small like a dead fly. Look at the great consequences that it can produce. You know, and I'm just thinking, there are probably many examples that we could come up with. Maybe you have some personal examples of some things that are just so small but have can produce very drastic consequences. You know, I'm thinking about the space shuttle, the Challenger that blew up. You know, what was the cause of the space shuttle exploding? Well, come to find out, the immediate cause of the space shuttle exploding was because two little rubber O-rings were missing. Now, I mean, notice that. Look, go Google the size of O-rings, okay? And then look at them in comparison to the actual size of the space shuttle. I mean, something so small, but yet ultimately ended in a very tragic way. Well, notice the point here. A little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. So, you know, a person can be wise and a person can be honorable, but they can also make a foolish mistake that will ruin and eliminate kind of the worth that they had because of the wisdom and honor that they portrayed. Notice verse 2. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Well, ultimately, these proverbs seek to communicate the same truth, namely that wisdom and folly lead a person down very different paths in life. If you want to, you know, at least from the way that Kohelet is portraying it, and it is true, if you want a good life, a life that is blessed, walk down the path of wisdom. If you want a life that is full of destruction, well, you just continue to walk the path of the fool. Notice verse 3, we're not done talking about the fool. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense. And he says to everyone that he is a fool. Well, here we're kind of expanding the image that was first portrayed in verse 2, what we just got done reading, right? What is said that this fool is actually doing on this road? Well, nothing specifically, right? We're not aware of the actual action that this fool was portraying that shows other people that he's a fool. But we know that other people can look to his actions and ultimately conclude that this man lacks wisdom. What's actually said is he lacks sense. And you might go over to Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 32 and check out what that verse says. It talks about the fool lacking sense. In other words, the main idea of this verse is a fool cannot hide his foolishness. Okay, his foolishness is going to be known to other people. But then we get to verse 4. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. Now, this verse is pretty interesting, because let's look at what was said in chapter 8. Chapter 8, we'll read verses 2 through 9, or at least to when we get the idea. I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time in the just way. Well, look at verse 3 again. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Well, okay, you know, if you have sorry, I lost my train of thought. We just looked at this verse. Let's go back to chapter 10. What is said here, if you know that the king, if you know the ruler is upset with you, what aren't you to do? Well, you're not to leave. Why? Well, I guess we could suppose a number of reasons, but one reason is probably going to be, by your leaving, you are only going to add to the anger of the king. So don't do that. Just stay. But notice, don't fight anger with anger. Okay, if a superior is upset with you, don't continue to anger by them, either by leaving or by responding in anger while you're in his presence. Instead, calm the king, cool his wrath by your gentle presence. Don't continue to push, that I think we can say more in a little while. Notice verse 5. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. Okay, Kohelet, what have you seen that is actually bad? Well, I've seen the ruler make an error. Now, when we're talking about this error, we're talking about someone making a mistake. Maybe we're actually talking about negligence or forgetfulness. And this error, this small error, has grave consequences. Notice the error that the king has made. He's put people that are incapable of occupying positions of authority in positions of authority. In other words, he's taken fools and he's elevated them to a superior status over fools and wise people alike. And as you can imagine, this creates a very bad circumstance for society. It kind of completely unravels society. Society, because of this, would be in a very chaotic state. So folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. Well, notice that according to Kohelet, the rich ought to be in a high place and the fools ought to be in a low place, but that's not the case. I have seen slaves on horses. Now, this privilege of riding horses was only given, sorry, my throat has been bothering me for a couple of days. This, the riding of horses was reserved for the most privileged of individuals. You would expect the prince to be riding on a horse, and you would expect a slave to be following the prince. But instead, the slave is on the horse, and the prince is following the slave. This is just another indication that society has been turned upside down and things are not going well. Verse 8, he who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. So let's look at Psalm chapter 7. Psalm chapter 7 and verse 15, it kind of says something that is sort of familiar to this, although used in a very different way. He makes a pit, digging it out, and falls into the hole that he has made. His mischief returns upon his own head, and on his skull his violence descends. Well, notice, this is the doctrine of retribution, right? Bad people get what they deserve. If they do bad things, they're going to receive bad outcomes. Well, notice this pit was dug for somebody to trap somebody else, but in the midst of trying to trap somebody else, the bad person actually fell into their own pit. Well, notice we have something similar that is just said from what we've just read, but the idea is different. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. Well, here, we're not just limiting it to bad people. This is humans that have jobs to perform in everyday life can be hurt by those jobs. Their work can be very disastrous for them because you know what? We recognize this as humans. Why do bad things happen? Well, some bad things happen, but just because some bad things happen, there's really no rhyme or reason to it. There's really no way that we can explain it. Some good people can get hurt on the job. It is possible that if you are digging a pit that you can fall into your own pit and get hurt. Explain why that happened. Well, sometimes you just can't. Well, notice the person whose job it is to break through a wall might just find that there is a snake on the other side of the wall, and in an attempt to bring the wall down, they actually get hurt because they are bit by a snake. No one can avoid these consequences. It appears that they just happen. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. Well, here we go. We're now, moving on to two more examples of people being hurt or injured from their everyday life. We keep going. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. We can see the picture here, right? That there's a person that is trying to chop wood, and the axe that they are using, or they're trying to chop something, and the blade that they're using is very dull. And what has to happen? Well, if you're going to cut what you want to cut and you're cutting with a dull blade, you're going to have to exert more energy and more force, more strength behind the blow in order to cut the thing. Well, what is the smart thing? If you have a dull blade, the smart thing to do is not just to continue to chop with the dull blade or cut with the dull blade. The smart thing to do would be what? Would be to sharpen the blade, right? So what's said of the wise person? The wise person would know to do that, and because the wise person would know to do that, it would lead to their success, not only in being able to cut whatever it is they're wanting to cut, but their success will benefit them personally because they're not going to walk around like the fool who's going to be tired because he spent all day physically exhausting himself when he didn't have to. So, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Verse 11, if the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. Again, we've seen throughout the book of Ecclesiastes that Solomon says wisdom is to be favored over foolishness. But wisdom is not the ultimate goal. It's not the ultimate gift. It's not the ultimate thing. Why? Because wisdom is very limited, okay? Well, here's an example of when wisdom can be very limited. You know, snake charming is a very mysterious activity, and we're not going to get into all of that, but we see what Kohelet is at least trying to tell us. If the serpent bites before it's charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer, right? If the snake bites you and it is full of deadly venom, well, the fact that you can charm a snake no longer does you any good because you are about to die because you've been bitten. Again, I think we can see, I'm sorry that my voice is giving out. Let's look at verse 12. The words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. Now, here's the question with this verse. Does the wise man, based off of what he says, does that get him favor? In other words, these words that he say, people recognize as the value of these words, and because of that, favor is given to him, or do his words give favor, that is, actually give favor to another person? Well, maybe it's both. Maybe the words give favor to others, but in return, favor is given to him. If you had to be forced on it, it's get favor probably for himself, because look what's said at the end of the verse. But the lips of a fool consume him. Now notice what happens. The fool is destroyed because of the words that he uses. He continually runs his mouth, and because of that, he damages himself. Notice that's done to him, and the emphasis isn't on doing something to others. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is madness. Well, notice the problem with the fool and his mouth. He continues to talk. He doesn't know when to stop, but he's also speaking on things that he just doesn't know about. He has no knowledge of. And at first, when the fool begins to talk, everybody recognizes, that his words are silly. Everybody can recognize that his words are foolish. But as the fool continues to talk and continues to talk about things that he doesn't know about and can't have the ability to know about, he goes from sounding silly to just plain insane, right? That is probably a good point to stop, because I'm losing my voice, so I need to get some water, and we are about to run out of time. So I hope you're doing well. I can't wait to see everybody Sunday. God bless.